Hey again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. I'm here again with another one of my videos on the old garden roses, this time to cover the Chinas and their direct descendants. I almost started my whole video series talking about the Chinas because of their significance to rose history, but just because of chronological order, I wanted to get the ancient European roses in first, so I've covered off the Damasks, the Gallicas, and the Elbas in separate videos. You can go back to watch those if you'd like. Before I get going on the Chinas, I would remind you, if you haven't done so already, please hit the closed captioning button across the bottom of your screen there. That will give you a transcript of what I'm saying here, so when I get to trying to pronounce fancy French or Latin names and I mess them up, it won't throw you too far off of track. Okay, traditionally the story of the China roses begins around 1792 with the return of Slater's Crimson China from the trade routes, or the plant expeditions to China. Going back to England. That's the first of the four, what they call the stud Chinas. They're called studs because they're still studly, I guess, or probably because they contributed so much to the genetic material of following roses. So there was Slater's Crimson, Parsons Pink, there was Hume's Yellow Tea-Scented China a little bit later, around 1810, and I think about 1823 we got Park's Yellow. Tea-scented China. Those are the four stud Chinas by tradition. However, I did read an article recently, I think it's by Brent Dickerson, where he talked about that there were at least 3 other China roses that arrived during this time, and there are sporadic reports of China roses arriving to Europe prior to this time as well. So the fact that we call them the 4 stud Chinas, that's great, but there were definitely others that contributed to this story as well. Now, I said that I'm going to talk about the descendants of the China roses as well. That's because those 4, of those 4, I think there's probably one of them that's regularly in commerce today. The other 3 aren't readily available, maybe findable in some way or another, but they aren't a big group. And it really is in their progeny that they became prominent in roses. The reason why they were bred so quickly into the European roses is they had features that the European roses didn't have. So up to this point, when I've been talking about the European roses, almost all of them, with the exception of the autumn damask, were once blooming in the spring. The China roses brought with them the ability to rebloom throughout the season. And I guess that was pretty attractive because, hey, if you can have more flowers, why wouldn't you? The second thing they brought with them was the genetic propensity for the color of red. I'm talking pure scarlet red, not the fancy pink that they had tried to breed into a really dark purple with the Gallicas. The third thing that they brought with them was a new bloom form. It would have been quite novel at the time, although we see it all over the place today. That's that high-centered bud that you see on roses, florist roses particularly today, but definitely garden roses as well, particularly the hybrid tea varieties. And the fourth thing is that the old garden roses of Europe had habits that didn't lend themselves perfectly to small gardens. That is, the Elbas and the Damasks both were very, very large, tall, arching shrubs, and the Gallica, although a little bit shorter, was also heavily suckering. So in terms of a small garden, they weren't all that suitable. So those are the 4 genetic characteristics that were brought back with the Chinas, and the European breeders went gaga over them. So next thing I'm going to talk about here is 3 of the classes that arrived or were bred from the China roses shortly after their arrival. And that should give you some insight into how the Chinas eventually made up the dominant genetics of the modern roses. The first of these groups of China roses that I want to introduce is the Noisettes, which became very important into later European breeding of the China roses. But it itself was not initially bred in Europe. In fact, the first Noisette rose was bred in America, not by a guy named Noisette, but by another guy, his neighbor, named John Champney. Now, Noisette, initially, Philippe Noisette, whose name got attached to the rose eventually, had provided Champney with a cutting of Parsons' Pink China Rose, or as we also call it, Old Blush. Champney had bred that into a wild Eurasian species named Rosa moscata, or the musk rose, and come up with something that he called Champney's Pink Cluster. a gorgeous rose on its own right, but also really important because it became the mother plant of all of the Noisettes. Now, how that happened, some people like to put a little bit of drama into this story and say that Noisette got these or rushed these to market ahead of his neighbor, but it seems like it was a voluntary transaction, that Champney, in consideration for trading plants around, had given Noisette a bunch of seedlings of Champney's pink cluster, some of which made it back about 1814 to Noisette's cousin in France, where they were all the rage and became the foundation of a large group of roses. I'm also going to show you up here from that group the blush Noisette, which is a gorgeous rose with blousy pink and white flowers, and another one, Madame Alfred Carrère, which has that buff, beautiful flowers that I just love. All of these nicely scented and reblooming. So the Europeans used these as a foundation, gateway to get the reblooming into the European roses. The second group of the China roses I want to introduce today are the Bourbon roses. And the story that goes along with these is that on Ile de Réunion, or I guess it was previously named Ile de Bourbon, which is just east of Madagascar if you want to look on a map and find it. On that island, as the story goes, there were hedges planted of the autumn damask rose and Parsons pink china. And from natural crosses of those two roses arose the Bourbon roses. Now, that group there, the hybrids between the damasks and the china roses, made very variable results. By the time they reached back to Europe in 1820 and were incorporated into the breeding lines, they produced exceptional roses, but exceptionally different roses of all different sorts. So no uniformity there. First one I'll mention is Souvenir de Malmaison, which is just a gorgeous fleshy pink and very famous rose, still fairly widely grown. The second one I'll mention is La Reine Victoria, which is lots of petals, a rounded, almost globular flower shape. The third one I'll mention is, I just added this to my collection this year, is Variegata di Bologna, with that variegated white and dark red or pink stripes. And the final one, and the one that is most commonly grown in gardens today, is a Zephyrine Druhin. I've definitely pronounced that wrong. And it's a thornless, sort of small climber with gorgeously scented pink flowers. Overall, I will say about that one in my garden, my experience has been that it is a little susceptible to foliar disease, but don't take that as an indication of all the different Bourbons, because as I say, they're a widely variable group. The third of these China descended classes I need to introduce you to is the tea class. And the tea class is the tea in hybrid tea, so it becomes very dominant in later breeding of roses. But initially it descended from number 3 and number 4 of those 4 stud China roses, the Humes and the Parks tea scented Chinas. Now, just to explain, those two roses were a little different in character and had a more subtropical parentage to it. So when they brought it back to Europe, it was not fully hardy, or their offspring was not fully hardy, and had to be grown in conservatories or more tropical climates. And it was only through later crossing with some of the European roses and some of the other Chinas that they became more hardy and made their genetic contribution to the roses. Now, the 3 that I'll talk about today, or I'll show you examples of, are widely different as well. There's Climbing Lady Hillingdon in a brilliant yellow, Sombriol, which is just the most delicate blush color, and the third one I picked out was Francis de Breuil, just to give you an example of some of the stronger colors that were coming in from the China parentage here. Well, I know I've thrown a lot of names at you today, and let me assure you that even though I've made it pretty complicated, it's a heck of a lot more complicated than this. In fact, the breeders made it a lot worse, because when they got the Chinas into their breeding programs, they were not very consistent about the way that they classed the roses afterwards. So if they bred, for instance, a China with a Gallica, and it turned out to look more like a Gallica, as many of the first generation crosses would have, then they called it a Gallica and left it at that. So you have roses like Cardinal Richelieu or Belle de Crécy, which both definitely have China in them, but were classed purely as Gallicas. Or the Alba, Madame Plantier, is called an Alba today, but again, definitely has China in it. And then there's other ones like the China Damask, Sophie's Perpetual, which we don't know really the parentage of fully, but they didn't class it as a Bourbon. Doesn't look like a Bourbon in many other ways, but it's a China, one way or another. There's sort of a hodgepodge of other China roses that made their way in, either officially or unofficially, to the breeding lines of Europe, and we don't know that much about it. Okay, that's going to wrap up all the information I'd planned for today for the China roses and their immediate offspring. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, or corrections, please leave those in the comments below. And just for those rose geeks who like to stick around to the very end of my video and get one last nugget of information, I'm going to introduce one China rose that didn't actually make it into the breeding program directly. It arrived a little bit later, and it's Rosa chinensis mutabilis, which is still often grown in people's gardens today. It almost looks like if it has the effect of a bunch of different colored fluttering butterflies on a shrub. Really neat looking, and it displays the propensity of the China roses to do one other thing that the old European roses didn't do, which is that its flowers darken quickly with age. So the flowers open up in sort of an apricot shade and then darken through to a deep pink. So that's kind of a neat characteristic, and it's sort of indicative of the China breeding.